The silence in the dark attic was almost suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of a small heart, beating in sync with every anxious breath of the baby, whose wide eyes had yet to blink. It was a stormy night, the wind howling outside as the thunder rumbled through the walls of the old house. A flicker of light from a distant lightning strike illuminated the corner where a shadow shifted. Something large and moving. The baby's chubby hands reached out toward the dark, his innocent gaze locking onto the figure in the corner. An animal whose eyes shone with an unmistakable desperation. A German shepherd, chained to the rafters, its fur matted, body trembling, and eyes wide with fear. The baby's soft, unsteady steps brought him closer, the chains clinking with every shift of the dog's weight. But the dog didn't growl or bark. It only watched, its gaze filled with a deep longing, as if it could sense the innocence in the child. The storm raged on, but in that moment, it was as if time stood still. The baby reached out, his tiny hand brushing the dog's fur. The storm raged outside, battering against the old house with a ferocity that seemed to shake the walls. The wind howled through the cracks, sending gusts of rain spiraling across the windows, making the house creak in protest. Inside, the faint light of a flickering bulb hung above the attic, casting long, eerie shadows across the cluttered space. Dust motes swirled in the air, dancing in the faint beam of light that barely pierced the gloom. The attic, a forgotten place filled with old boxes and relics from years past, had never seemed so suffocating. The thick smell of damp wood and musty old furniture was almost overpowering, but what truly made the air feel heavy was the sense of something lost. Something broken. The baby, a small, chubby toddler just shy of his second birthday, stood at the top of the narrow staircase, his eyes wide with curiosity. His soft cotton onesie clung to his small frame, and his bare feet patted gently on the old wooden floors as he crept forward. The storm outside mirrored the chaos that had descended into the house. The wind, the thunders, the flashing lightning that cast fleeting shadows across his innocent face. He had wandered away from his mother, who had been upstairs cleaning and sorting through boxes in the attic. Her absence had gone unnoticed at first, but soon, a strange, almost imperceptible sound began to fill the silence. Soft whimpers, faint cries that seemed to echo from the darkest corner of the attic. His small fingers gripped the edge of the attic door, his hand pushing it open slightly, as he stepped inside, lured by the curiosity that had always been his companion. The storm outside intensified, but the baby felt a strange sense of calm inside the attic. The air was thick with tension, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, something that stirred deep inside his chest as he continued to follow the sound. His steps were slow, measured, his tiny body filled with determination. He had no way of knowing what he would find, only the inexplicable pull to uncover the source of the noise. As he ventured deeper into the attic, the light flickered again, casting quick, fractured shadows. And then, there it was, the dark figure in the corner, just beyond his line of sight. The baby's eyes locked onto it immediately, drawn to the figure's presence like a magnet. The storm continued to roar, but in the dim attic, it was as if time itself had stopped. The German shepherd sat there, its back to the baby, its fur matted and dirty, its large frame tense with anxiety. Its tail, usually a symbol of joy and excitement, hung limp between its legs, almost as if it had forgotten what it felt like to be carefree. The chain wrapped around its neck clinked as the dog shifted, the sound echoing off the walls, sharp and metallic. The dog was trapped, confined by its chains, unable to escape, and yet, there was a glimmer in its eyes. A mix of fear and something else. Something desperate. The baby's small heart pounded in his chest as he took another step forward. His tiny hands, chubby and unsteady, reached out toward the dog, not with hesitation but with the innocent trust that only a child could have. There was no fear in his eyes, only curiosity. He had never seen a dog before, but something about the creature before him seemed familiar, almost comforting. The German shepherd turned its head slightly, its eyes meeting the baby's gaze for the first time. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the soft rhythm of the rain outside and the occasional crack of thunder. The dog's eyes were wide with a deep, almost human-like sadness, as if it had been waiting for this moment, this touch. Its gaze softened as it looked at the child, and a wave of understanding seemed to pass between them. It was as though the dog, too, felt the bond, the connection that could not be explained by words or reason. The baby took a hesitant step closer, his fingers now brushing against the dog's fur. The dog didn't flinch, didn't growl or bark. Instead, it sat motionless, its body trembling slightly, as though it was unsure of what to do, of how to react. Its powerful form, once an intimidating force, was now reduced to something vulnerable, something broken, chained to a fate it could not escape. Yet there was still a spark in its eyes, a spark of recognition, of yearning, of longing. For a brief moment, the baby's innocent hand rested on the dog's fur, and the world outside seemed to disappear. In that single fragile moment, the bond between them was forged. A bond of love and trust that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. It was raw and unspoken, but it was powerful. The dog, after a long, painful silence, let out a soft whimper. It shifted slightly, trying to nuzzle against the baby's hand, the chain rattling with the movement. The baby didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out with both hands, pressing them gently against the dog's fur. The warmth of the dog's body seeped into his small hands, and the baby smiled softly, a quiet, unspoken understanding passing between them. The dog, despite its pain and fear, leaned into the baby's touch, as if finding solace in the child's innocence. For the baby, it was an act of pure kindness, an instinctive gesture that would later come to symbolize the deep connection they shared. The dog had been abandoned, left in the dark attic with no one to care for it, but now, in this moment, the baby was there, offering the only thing he could give: comfort. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but in the attic, it was as if the world had stopped. The dog and the baby stood together in the quiet, their bond forming in the most unexpected of ways. The chains that held the dog down were still present, but for a brief moment, the dog felt free. The baby's touch, so simple and innocent, had provided a glimpse of hope. And in that silence, as the storm howled outside, both the baby and the dog knew that something had shifted. This was only the beginning of a journey that neither of them could have imagined, but one that would test the limits of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. The soft clicking of the baby's bare feet on the floor was the only sound that remained, a rhythmic pattern that was suddenly interrupted by the sharp sound of a door creaking open. The storm outside had only grown worse, now pounding against the house with relentless fury. Lightning illuminated the attic, casting strange, flashing shadows across the room. But the silence between the baby and the dog remained. The baby's tiny hand still rested gently on the dog's fur, feeling the warmth that seemed to pulse under the surface. The dog, despite the heavy chains around its neck, leaned slightly into the child, its once tense body now relaxed in a rare moment of trust. The two seemed oblivious to the storm raging outside, lost in the quiet understanding that had blossomed between them. But then the sudden sound of footsteps echoed up the stairs, sharp and hurried, interrupting the fragile peace they had found. The baby's head snapped up, his gaze breaking from the dog as he turned toward the sound of his mother's frantic footsteps.
"Where are you?"
Came the voice, thick with panic. "Charlie." His mother's voice, usually so soothing and warm, now sounded strained, worried. The baby didn't respond. His attention was still entirely focused on the dog, his hand moving to stroke the creature's back once again. The dog, too, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere, its body going stiff as it pulled back slightly, wary of the approaching footsteps. Then, the door to the attic opened with a soft groan, and the baby's mother stepped in. Her eyes widened immediately when she saw the scene before her. The baby standing so close to the dog, one hand resting gently on its fur, the dog staring at the child with a mix of fear and affection in its eyes. "Oh my God!" she gasped, rushing forward with a mixture of horror and concern. "Charlie, get away from that dog!" Her voice trembled with urgency, her protective instincts kicking in as she reached out to pull the baby away from the animal. But the baby, his eyes still locked on the dog, refused to move. His tiny body shifted slightly, leaning further into the dog as if to reassure it, as if he knew that the dog was not a threat. He had no fear, only the pure instinct of a child who knew nothing but love and curiosity. The dog, sensing the tension in the air, stood up slowly, its eyes darting back and forth between the mother and the child. The chain rattled with a soft clink as it tried to move, but the weight of the metal kept it tethered. "No, please," the mother murmured, taking another step forward, her heart racing. "Stay back. It might bite." She had no idea what she was walking into. The dog wasn't dangerous, not to the baby. At least, but her mind was clouded with fear and worry. It wasn't just the dog's presence that frightened her, it was the situation. The attic, the chains, the baby so close to an animal she couldn't trust, it all felt too much. "Charlie, come here now." Her voice broke through the growing tension, more forceful now. The baby's small form shook slightly at the sound of her raised voice, but instead of retreating, he took another hesitant step toward the dog, his little hand still clinging to the animal. The dog lowered its head, its eyes softening once again. There was a strange sense of protectiveness in the air now, a shift in the energy that neither the baby nor the dog could ignore. "Charlie!" The mother's voice snapped through the air again, desperate now. She rushed forward, this time grabbing the baby's arm and pulling him gently away from the dog. The baby, startled for the first time, let out a small cry of protest, his small body instinctively reaching back toward the animal. But his mother's grip was firm, and she lifted him up, holding him tightly against her chest. For a moment, everything froze. The baby whimpered softly in his mother's arms. The dog, now alone again, stood motionless, staring after them with wide, pleading eyes. "Mummy, no." The baby's voice was small, almost lost beneath the storm outside. He reached out again, his tiny fingers grasping the air, as if he could still feel the connection to the dog. The mother looked down at him, her heart breaking at the sound of his voice. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her tone softening for the briefest moment. "It's not safe. That dog is dangerous. We don't know what it's been through." The baby's brow furrowed in confusion, and he continued to reach for the dog. His face filled with a kind of sadness the mother couldn't understand. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized the baby had already formed a connection, an unspoken bond with the animal. But she couldn't allow it. Not yet. Not when the dog was still chained, its situation unclear. And her own maternal instincts screamed for her to protect her child from whatever dangers might be lurking in the shadows. "Mummy will make sure the dog is safe," she said, her voice shaking as she tried to soothe him, though her heart wasn't sure if she believed it herself. She turned her attention back to the German shepherd, whose eyes were now filled with a mixture of confusion and sorrow. She couldn't bring herself to approach the dog. Something about its situation felt wrong, too wrong for her to ignore. She turned away, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to make. The chains were too tight. The dog was too large, too wild in her eyes. And yet, in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that she couldn't ignore the bond that had already formed between her baby and the dog. "Tomorrow," she murmured, almost to herself. "Tomorrow we'll get help. We'll figure this out." But the dog's eyes never left them. It sat there in the dim light, alone again in its chains, but now, the emotional weight of the baby's touch lingered in its heart. It was a bond forged in silence, in a moment that neither the mother nor the baby could fully understand, but one that would change everything going forward. The morning light was weak, diffused by the thick clouds that still clung to the sky. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving behind a heavy dampness in the air. The house felt colder than usual, as if the warmth had been sucked out during the night, leaving only the lingering shadows of what had transpired. Charlie, the baby, sat quietly on the floor of the living room, his chubby hands wrapped around a stuffed bear that had once been his favorite toy. Now, the bear lay forgotten in his lap, its once vibrant colors faded from the countless hours it had spent in his arms. His attention, however, was not on the toy. His mind, so young yet filled with a strange kind of understanding, was elsewhere, on the German shepherd chained in the attic. His mother, Emily, stood at the kitchen counter, the phone pressed to her ear as she spoke in low, urgent tones. She had made up her mind. She would call animal control. It was the only solution. The dog had to be removed from the attic. The thought of it being confined there, alone and vulnerable, was too much to bear. It was dangerous, wild even, and yet her mind kept drifting back to the bond she had witnessed between her child and the animal. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Please send someone as soon as possible. It's a large dog and it's chained up in the attic. We don't know how long it's been there." As she spoke, her eyes flickered to Charlie, who sat silently on the floor, his small hands gripping the stuffed bear tighter. She couldn't help but feel a pang in her chest at the sight of him. His eyes, so innocent and full of trust, had been locked onto the dog the night before. He had reached out to it with such vulnerability, such pure intention, and yet she couldn't allow him to continue forming this connection. Not with an animal like that. Not when it was in such a compromised state. "Yes, thank you. We'll be waiting," she added, hanging up the phone with a quiet click. She turned back to the living room, her heart heavy with the decision she had made. Charlie's gaze followed her, and without a word, he got up and walked toward the stairs. His tiny feet padded across the floor in a soft rhythm, and for a moment Emily felt a strange unease stir within her. Her heart clenched. She knew where he was going. "Charlie!" she called, her voice laced with panic. She hurried after him, but it was too late. The baby had already reached the top of the stairs, his small hand gripping the wooden railing as he began to climb. She rushed to catch up with him, her hand on his shoulder, as she gently pulled him back. "You can't go back up there, sweetheart," she said softly, kneeling down to his level. But Charlie only looked at her with a quiet determination, his eyes filled with a mix of confusion and longing. He reached out, his tiny hand brushing against her cheek before pointing up toward the attic. He didn't need to speak. His gaze was enough. "Charlie, please," Emily said, her voice faltering as she knelt beside him. "The dog, it's not safe. It's been through too much. It's been trapped for God knows how long." Her words, though filled with concern, didn't seem to reach him. The baby's attention was solely focused on the attic door, his tiny hands still reaching out for the dog. Emily's heart tightened in her chest. She had never seen her son like this. The bond that had formed between them, so pure, so unspoken, was deeper than anything she could have anticipated. She had expected fear, resistance, but what she saw instead was an overwhelming sense of trust and connection. Charlie wasn't afraid of the dog. He was drawn to it. For a moment, Emily hesitated. Her heart ached as she looked into her son's eyes, those wide, innocent eyes filled with such love and empathy. How could she deny him this? How could she separate him from an animal that had already become his friend? But she had to. She had no choice. She had to protect her son. The dog had been abandoned, neglected, and now it was her responsibility to ensure that it was removed safely from their home. She couldn't allow it to remain a threat to her child, no matter the bond that had formed between them. "Come on, Charlie," she said, her voice gentle but firm as she lifted him into her arms. "Let's go back downstairs, okay? We'll wait for the animal control people to come and take care of it." Charlie's small hands clung to her as she carried him away from the stairs. But even as she moved him away, she could feel his eyes, full of confusion and sadness, fixed on the attic door. He wasn't ready to let go, and neither was the dog. Downstairs, Emily set Charlie down in the living room again, but his attention was already elsewhere. He waddled over to the window and stood there, peering out at the gray sky, his hands pressed against the cool glass. He could still hear the sound of the storm from the night before, though it had long since passed, leaving only the distant rumble of thunder behind. Emily's heart ached as she watched him. She had never seen him so focused, so determined. And yet, as much as she wanted to comfort him, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The connection between her son and the dog was more than just a passing curiosity. It was something deeper. The phone rang suddenly, cutting through her thoughts. Emily answered it quickly, her fingers shaking slightly as she picked up the receiver. "Yes," she said, her voice tight. "Ma'am, this is Animal Control," the voice on the other end said. "We're on our way. We'll be there in about 20 minutes. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was finally happening. The dog would be removed, and her son would be safe. But as the minutes ticked by, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her was breaking. She glanced toward the stairs again. She knew that when the animal control workers arrived, Charlie would protest. He would fight to stay with the dog. She didn't know how she would explain it to him, how she would make him understand. But there was no other choice. The decision had already been made. And yet, as the doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of the animal control workers, Emily could feel the weight of the choice she had made pressing down on her heart. The dog would be taken away. And with it, the bond that had grown between her son and the animal, a bond that had already begun to change them both, would be severed. But for Emily, there was no turning back. She had to keep her child safe, even if it meant breaking her heart in the process. The doorbell echoed through the house, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over it. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she looked down at Charlie, who was still standing by the window, his small hands pressed to the cold glass. His eyes were fixed on the street outside, watching as the animal control van pulled up to the curb. The sound of the engine grinding to a halt was like a gunshot in the quiet room, loud and final. Emily swallowed hard. The moment she had been dreading was finally here. The dog would be taken away, and with it, the connection between her son and the animal would be severed. She wasn't sure if she could explain this to Charlie, let alone understand how this would affect him. The baby had already formed a bond with the dog, and that bond was deeper than anything she had anticipated. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of curiosity. It was something real, something pure. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had tried to reason with herself, telling herself it was the right thing to do, that it was for the safety of her child. But as she looked at Charlie, his innocent face filled with confusion and longing, she couldn't help but feel that something was slipping through her fingers. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She quickly wiped the tear that had gathered at the corner of her eye and made her way to the door, taking a deep breath before she opened it. 2 animal control officers stood in front of her, both wearing dark blue uniforms and carrying heavy-duty equipment. One of them, a woman with short brown hair and a stern expression, glanced up at Emily. "You called about the dog?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "Yes," Emily replied, her voice barely a whisper. "It's up in the attic. A German shepherd chained up. I don't know how long it's been there." The officer nodded, glancing over her shoulder at her partner, who was already walking toward the back of the van to retrieve equipment. "Let's take care of this quickly, then," the officer said, her tone still detached. "We'll bring it down. It's not the first time we've had to deal with something like this." Emily stepped aside, allowing the officers to enter. The baby, still standing by the window, didn't turn to look at them. His attention was locked outside. But Emily could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken sadness that seemed to radiate from him. The officers climbed the stairs quickly, each step a drumbeat in Emily's chest. She followed them, her feet heavy as if the weight of her decision was pulling her down. She hadn't wanted it to come to this, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was no other choice. When they reached the attic door, one of the officers, the man, knocked twice before turning the handle. Emily stood back, her hands trembling as she watched them enter. She couldn't look directly at Charlie anymore, not with the knowledge that she was taking him away from something he had grown to care for. The sound of chains rattling filled the air as the officers made their way to the dog. Emily couldn't help but feel her heart sink at the noise, a reminder of the dog's confinement, of the fear it had endured. But it wasn't enough to sway her decision. She had to protect Charlie, and the dog, as much as it might have felt like a lifeline to him, couldn't stay. Inside the attic, the German shepherd's eyes flashed with panic as the officers approached. It had been chained for so long. Its instincts had been dulled by fear and isolation. When the officer first reached for its collar, the dog recoiled, its body tense, ready to lash out if it felt threatened. But then, the baby's image flashed in its mind. The soft touch of the tiny hand, the warmth of the child's innocence. The dog hesitated, no longer sure if the human it had once feared was there to harm it or help it.
It's okay,
"Boy," the officer said gently, her hand still outstretched. "We're here to help." The dog growled low in its throat, its body still shaking, But it didn't attack. Instead, it backed away slightly, as if unsure of what would come next. Emily watched from the doorway, her heart racing, her breath shallow. She wanted to reach out, to stop this, but she couldn't. She had already made the choice. The officers worked quickly to untangle the chains that had wrapped themselves around the dog's neck. The thick metal links had been cutting into its fur, leaving raw patches on its skin. The dog whimpered as the chains were finally freed, its body collapsing onto the floor, as if it had forgotten what it was like to stand unburdened. Emily could feel her throat tighten. It wasn't the image she had expected, not the dangerous, wild animal she had feared, but a broken, battered creature that had been abandoned to rot in an attic. The realization hit her like a wave. The dog hadn't been the threat. It had been the one who needed rescuing. The officers helped the dog to its feet, and for a brief moment, the German shepherd looked up at Emily. Its eyes were no longer filled with fear, but something else. Something softer, almost pleading. The dog had been rescued, freed from its chains, but it was still searching for something it couldn't name. "Let's get him out of here," one of the officers said, gesturing for the dog to follow. But the moment the dog's paws hit the bottom step, its gaze shot straight to the doorway, where Charlie stood watching. Emily's heart stopped as she saw the look on the dog's face. It wasn't anger or fear. It was a look of recognition. A look that spoke of the bond they had formed in that attic, when the baby had been the only one who didn't treat it like a threat. The dog's body stiffened. Its eyes locked on Charlie as if it were tethered to him by some invisible force. "Mommy," Charlie whispered, his voice trembling as he held up his hand toward the dog. "Mommy, the dog." Emily turned to look at him, her throat tight with emotion. She had done what she thought was necessary. She had protected her son. But now, standing here, watching the baby's hands stretch out toward the animal, she realized that she hadn't just been protecting him. She had been protecting herself from the unknown bond that had been growing between them. For a moment, everything stood still. The baby's eyes were locked on the dog, and the dog, despite its own fear and confusion, didn't back away. It stood there, its body tense but its gaze softening as it looked at the child. "Charlie," Emily said softly, her voice breaking as she bent down to pick him up. "It's okay, sweetheart. The dog is going to be okay." But as she lifted him into her arms, she couldn't shake the feeling that the dog would never truly be free. Not as long as Charlie was still searching for it. Days passed since the rescue, but Emily could still feel the weight of the decision in every corner of the house. The house had returned to its normal rhythm. The hum of daily life, the clink of dishes being washed, the soft murmur of Charlie's voice as he played with his toys. But beneath it all was the quiet ache of something lost. The dog was gone, and Charlie, though his small frame seemed unchanged by the passage of time, had been different since that day. He didn't smile as much. He didn't reach for the window to watch the rain like he used to. Instead, he spent his days sitting on the couch, his small fingers curled tightly around the stuffed bear, his gaze often distant. Emily had tried to fill the void, offering her son comfort, trying to distract him with toys and books, but nothing seemed to reach him. He had stopped looking out the window at the world beyond. He seemed as if he were waiting for something, as if he were still searching for the dog. The dog that had been his silent protector, his companion in the darkness of the attic. The dog that had shared a bond with him that Emily didn't fully understand, but could feel in the pit of her stomach every time she saw him staring out the window. It wasn't just Charlie who was struggling. Emily, too, found herself haunted by memories of the dog's eyes. The soft pleading, the silent understanding. She couldn't help but think about the bond they had shared in those fleeting moments, before the animal was taken away. She had seen something in the dog's eyes that day. Something that went beyond the typical fear of an abused animal. There had been something there. A silent promise, a deep sense of trust that she hadn't fully comprehended until now. She thought about calling the shelter to check on the dog, but something held her back. The officers had told her that the dog would be cared for, placed in a proper home, away from the trauma it had endured. But that knowledge didn't make her feel better. The guilt gnawed at her, making her wonder if she had made the right choice. She had been so focused on keeping Charlie safe that she hadn't truly considered how deep the connection had already run between the two of them. One morning, as Emily prepared breakfast in the kitchen, she heard a soft sound behind her, the unmistakable sound of small feet padding across the wooden floor. She turned around, expecting to see Charlie coming in, but instead, she found him standing in the doorway, his eyes wide and filled with something she hadn't seen in days. Hope. "Mommy?" Charlie whispered, his small voice quivering with a mixture of excitement and fear. "The dog. I heard it. I heard him barking." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She glanced out the window, half expecting to see the dog outside, standing in the yard, waiting to be reunited. But there was nothing. Just the dull gray sky and the steady patter of rain against the window. "The dog's not here, sweetie," she said softly, kneeling down to his level. "The dog is at a shelter now, remember?" But Charlie shook his head, his little hand reaching for her as if he could touch the truth. "No, Mommy. I heard him. He's out there." Emily didn't know how to explain the ache that had begun to grow inside her heart. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay, that the dog would be fine. But she knew, deep down, that Charlie wasn't just talking about the dog. He was talking about something far deeper. The bond, the connection, the unspoken love that they had shared. That evening, as Emily sat in the living room, a strange feeling crept up on her. The feeling that perhaps Charlie wasn't the only one who missed the dog. She had been so focused on the idea of protecting him that she had failed to realize just how much the dog had been a part of their lives, even in such a short time. It wasn't just the baby who had needed saving. It was the dog, too. She had tried to move on, to fill the space with other distractions. But no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to be done. Maybe it was the fact that she hadn't fully understood the bond between the dog and Charlie. Or maybe it was because she knew deep down that what they had shared was something rare and powerful. Something that couldn't be easily replaced. The next day, Emily called the shelter. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number, her heart racing. She had told herself that the dog was gone, that it was no longer her responsibility. But now, standing at the crossroads of her emotions, she realized that she couldn't ignore the tug in her chest. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. "Hello, animal shelter?" A woman's voice greeted. "Hi, I adopted a German Shepherd recently." "Well, I didn't adopt him, but we rescued him. He was brought in, and I wanted to check on him." "Is he still there?" Emily asked, her voice faltering as she spoke. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of typing. "Yes, I see the dog you're referring to. He's still here with us. His name is Diesel, and he's doing well. He's been adjusting to the shelter and has shown a lot of improvement." Eyes he. "Is he okay?" Emily asked, her heart in her throat. The woman on the other end seemed to soften. "Yes, he's doing much better. We've been able to treat his wounds and he's starting to interact with other dogs. He's nervous, but he's opening up." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Diesel. That was the dog's name. She hadn't even known it before. She hadn't known the dog had a name, just that he had been lost, abandoned, and in need of someone to care for him. But now, hearing the confirmation that he was still alive, still breathing, she felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. He wasn't gone. He wasn't lost forever. The woman continued, "If you'd like, we can arrange for you to come visit him. He's ready for a new home, and we think he might be a good fit for your family." Emily's heart skipped a beat. A new home. She had never considered that before. She had never thought that Diesel could be a part of their family in a way that went beyond the brief connection they had shared. But now, hearing the offer, she felt something stir inside her, hope. "I'd like that," Emily said softly. "I'd like to see him." The days leading up to the visit to the shelter passed in a blur. Emily couldn't seem to settle her mind, her thoughts constantly drifting back to Diesel. The dog had been through so much, and though she tried to comfort herself with the idea that he had found a safe space at the shelter, a part of her still felt uneasy. She had made the call, had taken the step toward reuniting Charlie with the dog, but the fear of what that encounter might look like held her in a tight grip. She had never truly understood the depth of the bond between her son and the dog until now. She had thought it was simply a phase, a moment of connection that would fade over time. But when she had heard Charlie whisper about the dog's barking, when she saw the way he reached for the window each time it rained, she realized that this wasn't just a passing fancy for him. Charlie missed Diesel more than she had anticipated. But even as Emily's heart swelled with the hope that they could heal this wound, the fear loomed just beneath the surface. Diesel had been through trauma, and that could leave scars deeper than anyone realized. Would he remember the bond? Would he recognize Charlie? Would the dog still be the same? Emily sat at the kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through the window, casting long shadows across the room. She absent-mindedly stirred her coffee, her eyes wandering to the clock on the wall. It was almost time to leave. Charlie, as usual, had been quieter than normal. He hadn't mentioned the dog much since the call to the shelter, but Emily could see it in his eyes. The same hopeful gleam that had been there when he first heard the news. He was eager, but at the same time, there was a subtle tension in his posture, a quiet anxiety that mirrored her own. She stood up, setting her coffee cup down with a soft clink. "Charlie, honey," she called gently, "it's time to go. Are you ready?" Charlie looked up from the corner where he had been sitting, his fingers still wrapped tightly around the stuffed bear. For a moment, he didn't move, but then, slowly, he climbed to his feet, his small face breaking into a tentative smile. "The dog," he whispered. Emily smiled back, though her heart tightened at the sound of his voice. "Yes. Sweetheart, we're gonna see Diesel now. Are you excited?" Charlie didn't answer with words, but instead he reached for her hand, his grip tight, as if the mere act of holding her hand would make everything feel safe again. Emily squeezed his hand in return, a silent promise that she would be there every step of the way. The drive to the shelter felt longer than it should have. Emily's grip on the steering wheel tightened with each passing mile. She glanced over at Charlie, who was staring out the window, his small face pressed against the glass. The rain had started again, light but steady, and the steady rhythm of the drops against the windshield only deepened the silence in the car. As they pulled into the parking lot of the shelter, Emily's stomach twisted in knots. The shelter was large, a sprawling facility that was both welcoming and clinical in its appearance. The fences were high, and the grounds were meticulously maintained, but despite its tidy exterior, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the place was a reminder of the trauma the animals inside had faced. The shelter workers greeted them warmly, ushering them inside and into a waiting room where they could sit before meeting Diesel. As Emily and Charlie settled into the chairs, she could feel her heart racing. Her mind replayed every moment from the day they had rescued the dog, each second a reminder of the fear and uncertainty they had felt. Would Diesel remember them? Would he be happy to see them again? The shelter worker, a kind-faced woman named Sarah, stepped into the room with a gentle smile. "Are you ready to meet Diesel?" she asked. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves.
Yes,
She replied quietly, glancing down at Charlie. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Are you ready?" she asked him. Charlie nodded, his small hand clutching hers even tighter. "Okay," Sarah said, motioning toward the door. "Follow me." The walk down the hallway felt long, each step echoing in the quiet corridor. The walls were lined with cages, each holding an animal that had its own story, its own past. Some animals were sleeping. Others were pacing restlessly, their eyes filled with confusion or fear. Emily couldn't help but feel a wave of guilt wash over her. She had made the right choice for Charlie, but was it the right choice for Diesel? They reached the last room in the hall, and Sarah opened the door slowly, revealing Diesel sitting quietly in a corner of the room. He had been cleaned up since they had last seen him, his coat now shiny and smooth, though his eyes still held that deep sadness. He was no longer chained, but his body was still tense, as if it hadn't fully released the weight of his past. As soon as the door opened, Diesel's ears perked up, his head jerking toward the entrance. His eyes locked onto Emily and Charlie. For a moment, there was no movement, no sound. Just the weight of that look, as if Diesel was assessing them, trying to understand if this was the same people he had known, the ones who had reached out to him in that dark attic. And then, slowly, Diesel stood up, his body stiff and hesitant. He took a few cautious steps toward them, his gaze shifting from Emily to Charlie. The baby, still gripping Emily's hand, stared at the dog, his eyes wide with both wonder and fear. "Charlie," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "Go ahead. It's okay." With that, Charlie took a small, tentative step forward. Diesel stopped, watching him closely, his eyes softening as he watched the little boy approach. Charlie reached out slowly, his small hand trembling. Diesel's body tensed, but he didn't back away. Instead, he took another step forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. Diesel's tail twitched slightly, unsure, but still hopeful. Charlie's hand was only a few inches from the dog now. Emily held her breath, praying that everything would be okay. And then, with a soft whine, Diesel lowered his head and gently nudged Charlie's hand. The baby's eyes widened, and without thinking, he reached forward and stroked the dog's fur. Diesel stood still, his body relaxing as he accepted the touch. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. The bond between them, the one that had begun in the attic, was rekindled here, in the sterile, quiet room of the shelter. Charlie smiled, his eyes filled with pure joy, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt a weight lift from her chest. Diesel had remembered. He had recognized Charlie. It was the first step toward healing, for both of them. The days following their reunion with Diesel were a mix of relief and lingering uncertainty. Emily had hoped that the reunion would be the beginning of a smooth transition for both Charlie and Diesel, but the shadows of the past were not so easily shaken. There were moments of joy, of shared smiles and laughter, but there were also moments when the past seemed to creep back into the present, like ghosts that refused to be forgotten. Charlie was thrilled to have Diesel back in their lives. Every morning, he would rush to the living room, his eyes searching for the dog as soon as he entered. Diesel, for his part, had adjusted to the new home with surprising ease. He had quickly learned the rhythm of the household, his body relaxing as he settled into a routine with Charlie. The bond they had shared in the attic, formed in the unlikeliest of circumstances, was growing stronger each day. But even as the warmth of the reunion filled their home, there was a constant undercurrent of tension. Diesel's past, though buried beneath layers of affection, still lingered. Every now and then, the dog would flinch at certain sounds. The slam of a door, the clink of a collar, the faintest movement that reminded him of the chains that had once confined him. His eyes would momentarily cloud over with fear, and Emily could see the shudder run through his body. Charlie, with his innocent love and boundless compassion, didn't understand. To him, Diesel was his friend, his protector, the one who had always been there for him. He would reach out to the dog, patting him gently, oblivious to the fact that Diesel's heart still carried the weight of his past. One evening, as Emily was preparing dinner in the kitchen, she heard the unmistakable sound of the dog growling. It was low at first, a rumble from deep in Diesel's chest that sent a shiver down her spine. She hurried into the living room, her heart racing, her mind immediately jumping to the worst possible conclusions. Had Diesel turned aggressive? Was there something wrong? But when she entered the room, she saw Charlie sitting on the floor, his tiny hand stretched out toward Diesel, who was standing in front of him, his hackles raised, his eyes wide with fear. The girl had deepened, a protective warning that sent a chill through the air. "Diesel, stop!" Emily shouted, rushing forward to intervene. She knelt down beside the dog, gently placing her hands on his shoulders. Diesel's body was stiff, his eyes locked on Charlie, his mouth slightly parted as though he was ready to bite. But the moment Emily's hand made contact with his fur, Diesel froze. The growl ceased immediately, and his body relaxed, but the fear still lingered in his eyes. He was still trembling, his body taut, as if he didn't know whether to trust this moment of calm. "Charlie," Emily said softly, her voice filled with concern. "Back away, sweetheart." The baby, who had been so eager to pet Diesel, pulled back slowly, his eyes filled with confusion. He didn't understand why Diesel was acting this way. To him, the dog had always been kind, always been there to comfort him. But now, there was a distance between them. An invisible wall that had risen from the shadows of Diesel's past. Diesel. Emily whispered again, her hand still on his fur, gently petting him. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the way his body remained coiled, ready to spring into action at any moment. It's okay, boy. You're safe now. For a long moment, nothing changed. Diesel stood rigid, staring at the baby with wide, fearful eyes. Then, as if hearing the soft cadence of Emily's voice, something in him began to shift. His body relaxed, his tail twitching slightly, though he still kept his distance from Charlie. Emily stood up, her heart heavy with the realization that Diesel was not completely healed. The trauma from his past still haunted him, lingering like a shadow that refused to leave. The scars on his body were visible, but the ones in his mind were deeper, harder to see. She turned to Charlie, who was now sitting quietly on the couch, his face full of confusion. "Sweetheart," she said softly, her voice a mix of tenderness and sadness. "Diesel has been through a lot. He's not used to having someone so close to him all the time." Charlie nodded slowly, his small face scrunched in concentration. He didn't understand fully, but Emily could see that he was trying to make sense of it all. His love for Diesel hadn't faded, but he was beginning to sense that their bond was not as simple as he had once thought. For the next few days, Emily focused on giving Diesel space. She knew he needed time to adjust, time to feel safe in his new home. And she needed to help Charlie understand that Diesel's behavior wasn't a reflection of the love they had for each other, but rather a sign of the deep scars that had been left behind from his past. It was during one of these quiet days that Emily sat with Charlie and Diesel on the porch, watching the rain fall in soft sheets. Charlie was seated on the floor, his back against the wall, while Diesel lay at his feet, the dog's body still, and relaxed for the first time since they had brought him home. "Do you remember what Diesel was like before?" Emily asked quietly, her eyes on the dog. "How he was in the attic." Charlie looked up at her, his small brow furrowed in concentration. "He was sad," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now he's not sad. He's my friend." Emily's heart ached as she looked at the two of them. In Charlie's eyes, Diesel was a protector, a companion, a friend who had come back to save him. But in Diesel's eyes, the world was still filled with shadows. He had been abandoned, chained, and left to fend for himself. Even now, despite all the love and kindness Emily and Charlie had shown him, he still carried the weight of that fear, that abandonment, in his soul. But the bond they shared was real. It wasn't a simple thing. It was fragile, it was messy, and it was growing stronger every day. "Sometimes, Diesel will still be scared," Emily said, her voice soft but firm. "And when he is, we have to be patient with him. Just like we are with you when you're scared." Charlie nodded, his eyes turning back to Diesel, who now lay with his head resting on the ground, his body still tense but peaceful for the moment. He reached down, gently touching the dog's fur. Diesel didn't flinch this time. Instead, he allowed the touch, his eyes closing for a brief moment, as if he were savoring the quiet peace that had settled around them. Emily sat back, watching them, feeling a surge of hope. The road to healing wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But she knew one thing for sure: they were on the right path. It might take time, but together, they would heal. Together, they would move forward. And in that moment, she believed that maybe, just maybe, the shadows that haunted them both would eventually fade. It had been a few weeks since Diesel's reunion with Charlie, and though the atmosphere in the house had lightened, there was still a palpable tension in the air. Diesel, despite his obvious attachment to the family, remained haunted by his past. His body was relaxed when he lay on the couch or sprawled on the floor, but the occasional flinch or anxious glance would give away the memories that still plagued him. Emily saw it in his eyes, especially when loud noises startled him or when a door slammed too hard. His past was a shadow that refused to leave, lingering in the background of his otherwise peaceful existence. Charlie, of course, hadn't noticed any of this. To him, Diesel was simply his friend, the protector who had always been there. the one who had saved him in the attic, and the one who was now his constant companion. Every morning, Charlie would rush to the door, calling out for Diesel, his excitement palpable, his love untainted by the complexity of what Diesel had been through. It was as if the bond between them existed on a level far deeper than understanding, a pure connection that only a child could form. One afternoon, Emily was cleaning up the kitchen when she heard the unmistakable sound of Charlie's voice, followed by the excited barking of Diesel. She paused, a small smile forming on her lips. It was always a moment of joy when Diesel responded to Charlie's calls, his voice now stronger, more confident. But today, there was something in the dog's bark, something urgent. Rushing into the living room, Emily's heart skipped a beat when she saw Charlie standing near the open window, his body frozen, his eyes wide with fear. Diesel was standing beside him, his hackles raised, his body tense, and his gaze fixed on something outside the window. The dog's growls were low, warning, almost as if he were trying to communicate something. "Charlie!" Emily called out, her voice filled with concern. She walked toward her son, kneeling down beside him. Mommy, there's someone outside," Charlie said, his voice shaking. He pointed toward the yard. Emily looked out the window, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing just beyond the yard, was a figure. A man tall and broad-shouldered, walking slowly toward their property. He wore a hooded jacket, his face partially obscured. The man didn't seem to notice the window was open, nor did he appear to be in a hurry, but his presence was unsettling. Emily's pulse quickened as a wave of unease washed over her. "Stay here, Charlie," Emily whispered, her protective instincts kicking in. She gently pulled her son back from the window, her eyes never leaving the figure outside. She could feel Diesel beside her, his body taut, the hairs on his back standing on end. It wasn't like Emily to jump to conclusions. But there was something about the man that didn't sit right. He wasn't supposed to be there. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, and anyone unfamiliar was cause for concern. She couldn't help but feel a sudden sense of dread. "Diesel," she whispered, kneeling down next to the dog. "Stay calm, boy. We're okay." Diesel's body remained tense, his eyes fixed on the man outside. But despite the fear in his body, the dog didn't move. He was still watching, waiting, as though he understood something Emily didn't, or couldn't. Emily turned back to Charlie, who was still standing next to her, his face pale. She grabbed her phone and quickly dialed the police, her heart pounding as the operator answered. She gave them the details. A suspicious person on their property, a man they didn't recognize. "Stay inside, Charlie," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with concern. "I'm going to check the back door. Stay close to Diesel." Charlie nodded, clinging to the dog's side. Emily moved swiftly, her body tense as she made her way toward the back of the house. Diesel followed her every step, his eyes still focused on the man outside. She could feel his presence, the way he walked just slightly ahead of her, like a silent protector, ready to defend if necessary. As Emily reached the back door, she peered through the small window, searching the yard. The man was still walking around the edge of the property, heading toward the side of the house. Emily's grip tightened on the doorknob, but before she could make a decision, she heard a sound, a soft shuffle behind her. Diesel had followed her, his body now bristling with energy, his eyes locked on the door. Emily froze. "Diesel, no," she whispered, her heart pounding. She reached down, placing her hand on his collar, trying to restrain him. But Diesel, sensing the growing danger, had no intention of waiting. With a sudden burst of strength, he pulled away from Emily and bolted toward the door. "Diesel!" Emily shouted, panic rising in her chest. She rushed after him, but it was too late. The dog had already pushed the door open with a force that surprised her. Diesel was out of the house in an instant, his powerful legs carrying him toward the stranger with frightening speed. "Stay back!" Emily screamed as she rushed after him. But Diesel was already in the yard, his body low to the ground, his eyes locked on the intruder. The man, caught off guard by the dog's sudden appearance, stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening in fear. For a moment, everything was still. The rain had stopped, leaving only the hum of the wind and the tense silence that surrounded them. Diesel stood just a few feet away from the man, his growl vibrating through the air. His body was taut, every muscle ready to spring into action. The intruder hesitated, his hands slightly raised in surrender. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving Diesel's. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I was just looking for my dog." "Your dog?" Emily asked, her voice tight with disbelief. The man nodded, his hands still raised.
Yeah.
"I lost track of him a while ago. I thought he might have come here." "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was home." Emily narrowed her eyes, her mind racing. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Why are you on our property?" "I didn't mean to trespass. I'm sorry. I've been looking for him everywhere." The man stammered, taking another hesitant step back. Emily's mind was in turmoil. There was something about the man's demeanor that didn't add up. He seemed nervous, almost too nervous. But before she could press further, Diesel let out a sharp bark, the sound filled with warning. He wasn't about to back down. "Stay right there," Emily said firmly, her voice commanding. She moved toward the man, her gaze still locked on him, making sure to stay between him and Charlie, who had now appeared in the doorway behind her, his small face full of curiosity. The man backed away slowly, his eyes still on Diesel. "I'll go. I didn't mean to cause any harm. I just wanted to find him." Emily didn't trust him. She didn't lower her guard until he had walked to the end of the yard and disappeared through the gate. Only then did she finally allow herself to relax, though her heart was still racing in her chest. She turned to Diesel, who had already relaxed, his body returning to a state of calm. It was clear now. Diesel had been watching, waiting, ready to protect Charlie, just as Emily had hoped. The dog had once again shown that he was the guardian he had always been, his instincts sharp despite his past. "Good boy," Emily whispered, kneeling down to pet Diesel. "You did good." Charlie, his eyes wide, rushed forward, wrapping his tiny arms around the dog's neck. "Diesel, you saved us." And for the first time in a long while, Diesel allowed himself to relax completely. He had protected the family, just as he had promised in that dark attic so long ago. The weeks following the encounter with the stranger brought a new sense of peace to the household, but there was an underlying tension that still clung to the air. Diesel, though becoming more comfortable in his new home, had moments of regression. He was still haunted by his past, his once vibrant spirit sometimes clouded by fear and anxiety. Emily watched him closely, her heart aching every time he flinched at a loud noise or recoiled from sudden movements. Charlie, ever the innocent soul, had grown even closer to Diesel, unaware of the emotional scars the dog carried. To him, Diesel was his protector, the one who had saved him in the attic and now stood watch over him, ever present and always by his side. The bond between them was undeniable, and it had blossomed into something stronger than either Emily or Diesel had expected. But that bond was fragile, still in the process of being mended, and every now and then, it felt like it could be shattered by the ghosts of Diesel's past. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the storm clouds began to gather again. It had been an unusually hot day for the season, and the sudden shift in the air was almost suffocating. Emily stood in the kitchen, her hands busy chopping vegetables for dinner, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. A storm, both literal and metaphorical. Diesel had been acting strange that afternoon, pacing around the house, his eyes darting to the windows every few minutes as if expecting something to happen. It was unlike him. The calm, steady dog she had come to know was now on edge, and Emily didn't know why. As the wind began to pick up outside, Diesel's behavior grew more erratic. He was standing by the door, his body tense, his ears perked, his tail straight and unmoving. Emily had seen this behavior before. The dog's fight, or flight response kicking in, when something in his environment triggered his past fears. She didn't know what had set him off this time, but she could feel the change in the air, the electricity that hummed just below the surface. "Diesel." She called softly, her voice calm but filled with concern. She stepped toward the dog, but he didn't respond. His eyes were wide, his body shaking slightly. Emily's heart sank. She had learned over the past weeks that Diesel's trauma wasn't just physical. It was mental and emotional, too, and sometimes No matter how much love and patience she showed him, the weight of his past still lingered. Charlie, hearing the concern in Emily's voice, toddled into the room, his small hands gripping the doorframe as he looked up at his mother. "What's wrong with Diesel, Mommy?" he asked, his voice small and confused. He could sense something was off, though he didn't fully understand what it was. Emily knelt down in front of Charlie, her heart aching. "I don't know, sweetheart. But Diesel's just scared. He's been through a lot, and sometimes things make him feel scared again." Charlie's brow furrowed in thought. He didn't fully comprehend what it meant to be scared, but he could feel the unease in the room, and he didn't like it. "Can I help him?" he asked quietly, his voice full of innocence and compassion. Emily smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "You already do, sweetheart. Just by being with him, you help." Charlie's face lit up with understanding. He walked over to Diesel, who was still standing by the door, his body trembling. The baby reached out and gently patted the dog's head, his touch light and reassuring. Diesel turned his head slowly toward Charlie, his eyes still filled with fear, but he didn't pull away. The dog's body relaxed just a little under Charlie's touch, as if the simple act of his small hand on his fur brought a brief moment of comfort. But the calm was short-lived. The wind outside picked up suddenly, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. The sound was deafening, like the storm itself was trying to tear the world apart. And with it, Diesel's fear erupted. With a sharp, startled bark, Diesel bolted to the other side of the room, his eyes wide with panic. His tail tucked between his legs as he skidded across the floor, his paws slipping on the smooth surface. He collided with the side of the couch, but his body was too tense to stop. Emily rushed forward, her heart racing. She reached out for him, but Diesel was already backing away, his growls low and fearful. "Diesel," Emily called, her voice filled with urgency. She reached out, trying to calm him. But the dog was now completely overtaken by fear. He was reacting not to her, not to Charlie, but to something deeper. To the storm within himself that raged uncontrollably, that stemmed from the abuse and neglect he had suffered before. Charlie, his face full of confusion and concern, watched as his protector cowered in fear. He didn't understand why Diesel was reacting this way. To him, the dog had always been the one who stood tall, who comforted him when he was scared. And now, to see Diesel afraid, to see his friend trembling and retreating, broke something in the little boy's heart. "Mommy, why is Diesel scared?" Charlie asked softly, his voice trembling. Emily's heart twisted in pain. She didn't know how to explain it to him. How could she? How could she explain the weight of Diesel's past when she didn't fully understand it herself? How could she explain that, despite everything, the dog still carried the ghosts of his former life? That even the love they shared wasn't always enough to chase away the darkness that had taken root in his heart. "I'm not sure, baby," Emily said, her voice soft with sorrow. "But we have to give Diesel time. He's been through things that make him afraid, but he's trying, Charlie. He's trying to be brave." Charlie nodded, his face serious and thoughtful. He seemed to understand more than Emily had expected. After a moment of silence, he reached out again, his small hand gently resting on Diesel's head. The dog didn't pull away this time. His body still trembled, but he allowed Charlie's touch, his eyes closing for a moment as if he were gathering the strength to overcome his fear. Emily watched the scene before her, a mixture of hope and despair swirling in her chest. The bond between Charlie and Diesel was powerful, unbreakable, but it was also fragile. Like a thread that could snap at any moment if not handled with care. Diesel had come so far, but the storm within him, the one that raged silently in the depths of his soul, was still there. And Emily wasn't sure if it would ever go away. But as she watched Charlie gently pet the dog, his eyes filled with compassion, Emily realized something. This wasn't just about Diesel's healing. It was about all of them healing together, learning to face the storms within themselves and finding solace in each other. It was a slow, painful process, but it was a process they would walk through together. "Diesel?" Emily whispered, stepping forward and kneeling beside him. "You're not alone anymore." The dog's trembling began to subside as Charlie's small hand continued to stroke his fur, and Emily gently rubbed the dog's back. For the first time in days, Diesel's body relaxed. His breathing, though still shallow, slowed down, and the fear in his eyes began to fade. It wasn't a complete healing. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Diesel wasn't fully free from his past, and neither was Emily. But in this moment, surrounded by love and the quiet rhythm of the household, they were taking the first steps toward overcoming the storm within them. The days following the storm felt like a fragile balance between calm and chaos. Emily had hoped that the worst of Diesel's fear was behind them, but she knew better than to expect that kind of resolution. The dog had made incredible progress, his bond with Charlie growing stronger each day, but the remnants of his past lingered like dark clouds on the horizon. Every step they took toward healing seemed to bring them closer to an emotional precipice. It was a late afternoon when the world suddenly felt like it was on the verge of shattering. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the living room. Emily was finishing up in the kitchen. The faint sound of Charlie's laughter drifting from the living room as he played with Diesel. She could hear the dog's playful growl, followed by the soft patting of his paws on the wooden floor. Charlie loved these moments, the quiet playtime with his friend. It was always a sign that the bond between them was growing stronger. But then, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by a sharp sound. The unmistakable clang of metal against metal, followed by a loud crash that echoed through the house. Emily's heart stopped as she rushed toward the living room, her mind already racing with fear. As she rounded the corner, her eyes widened in horror. The back door, which she had always kept locked, was wide open. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light, was the same man from before, the one who had appeared on their property a few weeks ago. The man was holding something in his hand, a large knife glinting in the dim light. Diesel was standing between him and Charlie, growling with a deep, menacing sound that made Emily's blood run cold. "Get away from my son!" Emily shouted, her voice breaking as she rushed forward. The man's eyes flickered toward her, but he didn't move. He was standing still, his gaze fixed on Diesel. He snarled, "I just want the dog." "What do you want with Diesel?" Emily demanded, her heart racing as she stepped forward, trying to protect Charlie, who was now clutching Diesel's fur in both hands. The man's eyes hardened. "I'm the one who found him. He belongs to me. He's mine," he said, his voice trembling with anger. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The fear that had been lurking in her chest since the first moment she had seen this man was now a full-blown panic. She had no idea who this person was or what he wanted, but one thing was clear. He wasn't here for good reasons. "Diesel is not yours," Emily said, her voice steady but firm. "He's a part of this family now, and you're not taking him." The man stepped forward, his eyes flickering with desperation. "You don't understand. He was my dog. I trained him. He's mine." But Diesel, sensing the danger, was already in motion. His low growl had shifted to a sharp bark, his body tense and ready. He positioned himself between the man and Charlie, his eyes fixed on the intruder with a protective ferocity that made Emily's heart swell with both fear and admiration. Diesel was no longer the fearful, anxious dog he had been when they first found him. He was the loyal guardian that Charlie had always seen him as. The man raised the knife slightly, brandishing it as if trying to intimidate Diesel, but the dog didn't flinch. He barked again, this time louder, more commanding. Emily could see the tension in Diesel's muscles, the way his body coiled as if preparing to spring into action. He wouldn't let anyone hurt Charlie. Not now, not ever. Emily took another step forward, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "Leave, now. Or I'll call the police." The man paused for a moment, his eyes darting between Emily, Diesel, and the open door. He clearly wasn't expecting resistance. But just as Emily reached for her phone, something changed in the air. A shift, a tension that none of them had expected. Without warning, Diesel lunged forward, his teeth bared, his body moving with a speed and precision that caught the man off guard. The man barely had time to react before Diesel's powerful body slammed into him, knocking him back into the doorframe. The knife flew from his hand, clattering to the ground as the man stumbled backward, completely unprepared for the dog's ferocity.
Diesel!
Emily shouted, but she couldn't hide the relief in her voice. The dog had acted without hesitation, protecting her son as if his life depended on it. And in that moment, it did. The man scrambled to his feet, his hands reaching for the knife, but Diesel was already on him, standing between him and Charlie. The intruder tried to back away, but Diesel wouldn't let him. The dog's teeth flashed as he growled, blocking the man's path, and making it clear that he was not going to back down. "Stay away from my son," Emily shouted again, her heart pounding. She was ready to fight back, to do whatever it took to protect Charlie and Diesel. The man's eyes flickered with realization. He was no match for Diesel's strength, and it seemed as though the situation had finally sunk in. He backed away slowly, his hands raised in defeat. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low and defeated. "I'll go. But this isn't over." Without another word, the man turned and fled out the door, disappearing into the night. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she watched him go, her body still trembling with adrenaline. For a moment, there was nothing but silence in the house. Diesel stood his ground, his body still tense, watching the man's retreating figure. Charlie, wide-eyed and holding his breath, was still clutching Diesel's fur, his little body shaking slightly from the fear of the encounter. Emily rushed forward, gathering Charlie into her arms and holding him close. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're safe now. Diesel protected us." Charlie clung to her, his small body trembling, but there was a sense of relief in his eyes. "Diesel saved us, Mommy," he whispered, looking up at the dog, who was now standing by Emily's side, his body slowly relaxing. Emily looked down at Diesel, her heart swelling with gratitude. The dog had protected them. He had faced the intruder with everything he had, and he had kept Charlie safe. "Good boy, Diesel," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "You're our hero." For a brief moment, Diesel's eyes softened, and he stepped forward, pressing his head gently into Emily's hand, his body still trembling with the remnants of the encounter. But for the first time in a long while, the storm within him seemed to settle. He had faced the fear, he had protected his family, and in that moment, Diesel was no longer the broken dog they had rescued. He was their protector, their guardian, their lifeline. And as Emily held Charlie close, she knew, without a doubt, that no matter what challenges lay ahead, Diesel would always be there, watching over them, ready to face any storm that came their way. The night after the confrontation with the intruder felt like it would never end. The quiet of the house, broken only by the soft rustling of trees outside, was almost oppressive. Emily sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes cast downward. Her mind was still racing, replaying every detail of the incident. The moment the man had appeared at the door, the fear in Charlie's eyes, and Diesel's unhesitating response to protect him. Charlie had fallen asleep beside her, his head resting against her shoulder, his tiny form still and calm in a way that only children could manage after a traumatic event. Diesel, too, had found a spot nearby, lying quietly on the floor, his body still tense but his breathing slowing with each passing minute. The dog had done what he was meant to do. He had protected them, just as Emily had always hoped he would. But the fear from that encounter still lingered, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Emily took a deep breath, and glancing over at Diesel, he was lying with his head resting on his paws, his eyes closed, but there was a constant flicker of awareness in his gaze. It was as if he was always on alert, ready to spring into action if needed. And though she admired his instincts, it also pained her to see the way he had become so hyper-aware, the way his body had learned to be constantly prepared for danger. He had never fully recovered from the trauma he had endured before, and now, that trauma seemed to have triggered something even deeper. Emily could see it in his eyes, a wariness that had been there from the start, even when they had first rescued him. And yet, he had shown an incredible capacity for growth, for healing, for love. For Charlie, the world had been righted by Diesel's actions. To him, the dog was a hero. Diesel had saved him. The love he felt for the dog had only deepened after the incident. But Emily knew it wasn't that simple. Diesel hadn't just fought to protect Charlie because he was a dog. He had fought because of the bond they had formed, a bond that had transcended the boundaries of fear, trauma, and time. She stood up slowly, careful not to disturb Charlie's peaceful slumber, and walked over to the window. The storm had passed, but the sky still held the gray remnants of the clouds. The air felt heavy, as if holding its breath, waiting for something. She felt Diesel's presence behind her, his eyes never leaving her. She turned to him and smiled softly. "I know, boy," she whispered, her voice filled with understanding. "You're still on guard, aren't you?" Diesel's eyes softened slightly at the sound of her voice, but his body remained tense. He had been through so much, and his instincts were still tied to the fear of his past. The fear of abandonment, of not being enough, of not being safe. Emily knew this. She had seen it in him every day since they had brought him home. But she also knew the love he had for Charlie, the love he had for her, was more powerful than any fear. Charlie shifted in his sleep, his small fingers clutching at the fabric of Emily's shirt as if seeking comfort. Emily sighed softly, running a hand through her son's hair. She could feel the weight of the past few days pressing down on her. The storm they had weathered together, the pain they had all endured. But despite it all, there was a glimmer of something else, something that she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope? Hope that things could still get better. Hope that, together, they could overcome the scars of the past. Hope that they could build a future where fear didn't have the final word. Emily sat back down, her hand gently stroking Charlie's hair. Diesel slowly walked over to them, lying down beside the couch, his head resting on his paws. His eyes, though still watchful, were no longer filled with the same frantic anxiety. There was a sense of calm settling over him. A calm that had only come because of the bond he had shared with Charlie, because of the love they had built together. "Thank you, Diesel," Emily whispered softly, her words more to herself than to the dog. "For protecting us. For being here." Diesel's eyes flickered up to meet hers. There was a depth in his gaze that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through. And though his past had shaped him, it was clear that Emily and Charlie had become part of his future. A future where healing was possible, where love could break through the shadows. The days after the incident were marked by small victories. Diesel's fear didn't vanish overnight, but it began to recede in ways Emily hadn't expected. He no longer flinched at every sound, no longer recoiled at every sudden movement. He had started to trust again, not just Charlie but her too. And in turn, Emily had started to trust him with her heart. But it wasn't just Diesel who was healing. Charlie too was changing. The little boy who had once been so unaware of the complexities of the world was beginning to understand. He had learned, in his own way, that love was a process of giving, receiving, and sometimes healing. He had learned to understand Diesel's fear, to be patient with him when the dog was nervous, and to offer his unwavering love when Diesel needed it most. One morning, as the sunlight streamed through the window, Emily watched as Charlie knelt down beside Diesel, his small hands gently brushing the dog's fur. Diesel, as always, responded with a soft nudge, his body still tense but his heart clearly open to the child who had become his lifeline. "Diesel," Charlie whispered, his voice full of innocence and understanding, "you're safe now. We're all safe." Emily's heart swelled as she watched them. The baby and the dog, two souls that had come together through the most unlikely of circumstances, bound by a love so pure, so deep, that it defied explanation. In that moment, Emily understood something. Healing wasn't just about overcoming fear or forgetting the past. It was about learning to live with it, learning to embrace the scars and move forward step by step, together. It was about finding hope in the darkness, knowing that, no matter what came next, they would face it as a family. The storm inside Diesel wasn't gone. Not yet. But with each passing day, it seemed a little less fierce, a little more manageable. And that, Emily realized, was all they could ask for. A little more hope, a little more peace, a little more love. And that was enough. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when the world outside seemed to hold its breath, the trees standing still, their branches bare and exposed to the elements. The house felt warm in contrast, a sanctuary from the biting winds that howled outside. Inside, the steady rhythm of daily life continued. the hum of the washing machine, the soft murmur of the television in the background, the quiet footsteps of Charlie as he played on the floor with his toys. But despite the calmness of the moment, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. For the past few days, Diesel had been acting strangely. His behavior had shifted from the usual calmness he had shown in the weeks since their reunion to a more agitated state. He was restless, pacing around the house. His ears constantly perked, his eyes scanning every corner as though he were waiting for something to happen. His once soft growls had turned into low, persistent warnings, a sign that he was sensing something beyond their immediate control. At first, Emily chalked it up to the change in the weather, the onset of a new season that might have triggered something in the dog's instincts. But as the days passed, the unease deepened. Diesel's movements became more erratic, and he started reacting to things he had never been fearful of before. It was as if his sense of danger had shifted into overdrive, and Emily wasn't sure why. Charlie, as usual, seemed unaffected by the tension in the house. He loved Diesel with an intensity that made Emily's heart swell. The dog, for all his fear and caution, had become the baby's protector, his companion in every adventure, his guardian in every storm. But today, Charlie's innocent joy was tinged with confusion. Diesel, for the first time, seemed to be pushing him away rather than drawing him closer. Diesel. Charlie called, reaching out toward the dog, but Diesel simply backed away, his body tense. His eyes locked on Charlie for a moment, and then he turned, pacing away, his growl low and frustrated. Emily watched from the doorway, her heart heavy. She had seen this behavior before. A dog that had been through trauma, that had learned to trust again, but was now faced with something he couldn't quite understand. Diesel was in pain, emotional pain that no one, not even Emily, could fix with just love and patience. She glanced at Charlie, whose small face was full of concern. "Mummy, what's wrong with Diesel?" he asked, his voice soft and confused. Emily knelt down beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "I don't know, sweetheart. But Diesel is just scared. He's been through a lot, and sometimes that fear takes over. But why won't he come to me?" Charlie asked, his voice tinged with sadness. "He always comes to me." Emily's heart broke at the sight of her son's confusion. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Diesel's fear to manifest in such a way. The bond between them had seemed unbreakable, and now it was fractured, if only for a moment. She needed to fix it, to make it right again. Sometimes, when people or animals have been hurt, it takes a little longer for them to trust again. Emily said gently, stroking Charlie's hair. "But Diesel will come back to you. You just have to be patient with him." Charlie nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on Diesel, who had now retreated to the corner of the living room, his body tense and watchful. The dog's eyes flickered back toward the baby, a soft whine escaping his throat, as though he too felt the strain of the situation. The feeling of unease that had settled over the house grew stronger that afternoon, and by evening, it had become impossible to ignore. The wind outside picked up again, the howling of the gusts filling the air. But this time, it wasn't just the weather that seemed to be causing the unease. The shadows in the house seemed darker, the air heavier, as if something was pressing in from the outside. Suddenly, the distant sound of a car door slamming caught Emily's attention. Her heart skipped a beat. She moved toward the window, her eyes scanning the darkened driveway. There, under the dim light of the porch, she saw a figure approaching the house. She froze. It was the same man from weeks before. The fear that had been growing in her chest now surged to the surface. She quickly turned to Diesel, who was standing at the door, his body stiff with alertness. His eyes locked on the intruder, and his growl began again, low and deep, vibrating through the room. "Not again?" Emily whispered under her breath. This wasn't just a fear of Diesel's past. This was something far more immediate. "Charlie, stay inside," Emily said, her voice firm as she moved toward the door. She couldn't risk the man getting any closer. She couldn't let him get to Charlie. The dog's low growl grew more intense as the man neared the porch. Diesel took a few steps forward, his tail tucked slightly between his legs, but his body coiled with readiness. Emily grabbed her phone, preparing to call the police. But before she could dial, Diesel suddenly lunged toward the door, his body powerful and determined. "Diesel, no!" Emily shouted, but it was too late. The dog was already in motion, his massive body crashing against the door as it flew open. Emily stumbled backward, but she didn't have time to react before Diesel was outside, confronting the man with all the fury and protection that had been building in him for weeks. The man's eyes widened in shock as Diesel rushed toward him, his growl now a full-throated roar. He tried to raise his hands in defense, but Diesel was faster. The dog knocked the man to the ground with a single swipe of his massive paws, pinning him in place. The man struggled beneath Diesel's weight, his face twisted in fear as the dog's teeth flashed dangerously close. "Stay down?" Emily shouted from the doorway, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and desperation. She had to stop this before Diesel did something irreversible. The man, realizing that he was no match for the dog's power, froze, his body going limp as he surrendered. Diesel's growl deepened, but he didn't bite. He simply held the man in place, as though making sure he understood that he would never get close to Charlie again. Emily rushed outside, her heart racing. "Diesel, stop," she called out, but her voice was steady now, filled with a calm authority. "It's okay, Diesel. Let him go." The dog's body tensed, but at her command he slowly released his grip, stepping back just enough to allow the man to crawl away. The intruder, now on his hands and knees, looked up at Emily, his face pale with fear and humiliation. "Leave," Emily said coldly, her voice unwavering. "If you ever come near my family again, I will make sure you don't leave." The man didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, casting one last fearful glance at Diesel, before fleeing into the night. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the street. But Emily didn't move until the man was out of sight. When she finally turned back to Diesel, her breath shaky, she knelt down beside him, her hands gently running through his fur. "You did good, boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You protected us." Diesel's body slowly relaxed, the tension easing from his muscles. His eyes met hers, and for the first time in days, Emily saw a flicker of peace in his gaze. He wasn't just the dog they had rescued anymore. He was their guardian, their protector, the one who had given everything to keep them safe. And in that moment, Emily understood the true weight of sacrifice. Diesel had put himself in harm's way for them, for Charlie, for her. And though he had come so far, the fear that still haunted him had been tested again. But he had passed. He had protected them. The storm within Diesel wasn't gone, but in the calm that followed, Emily knew that the bond they shared had grown even stronger. They were family, bound not by blood, but by love, loyalty, and the sacrifices they had made for each other. The days after the man's intrusion were quiet, but the silence felt different. There was a weight to it, as if everything had paused, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Diesel, ever the watchful guardian, had returned to his usual post near the door, his eyes scanning every shadow, his body still tense, but a little calmer than before. Emily had hoped that the danger was over, that the storm had passed. But she could feel it in her bones that something was still lurking, something that Diesel couldn't escape. And in the depths of her heart, she knew it was only a matter of time before that storm would hit them again. Charlie, for his part, seemed unaffected. He had returned to his usual routine, laughing and playing with Diesel, his innocent love for the dog unshaken. The bond between them was as strong as ever. The unconditional trust between a child and his protector, something that transcended the fear and uncertainty they had both endured. But Diesel, despite his outward calm, wasn't the same. The scars of his past still lingered, and Emily saw it in the way he recoiled at sudden noises, the way his body tensed when someone approached too quickly. He had fought valiantly to protect them, to shield Charlie from harm, but the internal battle raged on, a battle that no one could see but him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily found herself standing in the kitchen, her thoughts heavy. The house was still and quiet, the air warm and calm, but the unease inside her remained. She knew that Diesel had come a long way since they had rescued him. But something inside her told her that the final step of his healing was still waiting to be taken. And it was a step they would have to take together. The sound of Charlie's laughter echoed through the house, pulling her from her thoughts. She smiled faintly as she listened to him, his joyful giggles a stark contrast to the uncertainty she had been feeling. She turned toward the living room, where she saw Charlie sitting on the floor, Diesel at his side, both of them playing with a ball. But as Emily watched, something shifted in the air. Diesel's playful growl stopped abruptly, and his body stiffened. His eyes locked onto something in the distance. His ears pinned back as his low growl grew deeper, more intense. Diesel? Emily called, her voice rising with concern. Charlie, oblivious to the change, giggled and tossed the ball to Diesel, but the dog didn't move. He was still staring at the far corner of the room, his body taut and rigid, his eyes unblinking. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she looked around, trying to understand what had caused Diesel's sudden change in demeanor. The house was quiet, too quiet, and then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. The door, the back door, was slowly creaking open. Emily's heart stopped. She rushed toward the door, her mind racing, but before she could reach it, Diesel let out a deep guttural bark, his powerful body lunging forward, blocking her path. The door had barely been ajar, but Diesel's instincts had already kicked in, and he wasn't taking any chances. "Stay back!" Emily shouted, her heart racing. She backed away from the door as Diesel's growls filled the air, his body poised for action. The man who had intruded on their property before was not the only danger they faced. This time, the threat was something far more dangerous, something that had come from within. The door was open, and beyond it was the darkening night, an expanse of shadows. The wind howled outside, rustling the trees in a way that sounded almost unnatural. But as Emily watched Diesel, she realized what had triggered him. It wasn't just the sound of the door opening. It was the fear, the raw, primal fear that still lived inside the dog. The fear of being trapped, of being abandoned, of having everything he had fought for ripped away from him. "Diesel? No," Emily whispered, her voice filled with both sorrow and understanding. She could see the dog's internal struggle. He had been through so much. His fear had been built over years of neglect and abuse. And now, every shadow, every unfamiliar sound, triggered a response that Emily couldn't control. Charlie, noticing the tension in the room, stood up slowly, his small hands reaching out for the dog. "Diesel, it's okay. It's just the wind." But Diesel didn't listen. He was already in the doorway, his body low, his eyes locked on the darkened yard, his growl becoming more frantic. Emily couldn't stop him. She couldn't calm him down. It was at that moment that she realized Diesel needed to face the fear head-on. He needed to confront the storm within him, to walk through the fire of his past and come out the other side. And, if he was going to heal fully, he couldn't do it alone. Not anymore. "Diesel," Emily shouted, her voice breaking the tension in the room. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Diesel, it's okay. We're here. You're safe. You're home." For a moment, Diesel didn't respond. He stayed frozen in place, his body trembling with fear, his eyes fixed on the night beyond the door. But then, something in his gaze shifted. Slowly, hesitantly, Diesel stepped forward. He looked back at Emily, his body still tense, but his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. And then, as if taking a deep breath, Diesel stepped outside. "Diesel?" Emily cried, but the dog didn't stop. He moved toward the yard, his body low, his eyes scanning every shadow. Emily took a step forward, her heart pounding. But she knew this was something Diesel had to do. Charlie, holding onto the edge of the doorway, watched in silence. "Mummy," he whispered, his voice small and unsure. Emily knelt down, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart. Diesel needs to face his fear. And so do we." They stood together, watching as Diesel moved further into the yard. Emily's chest tightened with worry. But she didn't move to stop him. She had to trust that Diesel would come back to them, that he would find his way through the storm that had been inside him for so long. And then, as if in response to her unspoken hope, Diesel stopped. He stood in the middle of the yard, his body still, his head held high. For the first time in a long while, his growl faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. It was as if the dog had found peace in the heart of the storm. He had faced his fear, the fear that had haunted him for so long, and in doing so, he had taken the first step toward true healing. Diesel turned and walked back toward the door, his body still tense but his gaze softer now. He stepped back inside, his tail low but no longer between his legs. He had faced the fire, and though the embers still smoldered within him, he had come through it. Emily knelt down beside him as he re-entered the house, her hands gently stroking his fur. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're okay, Diesel. We're all okay." Charlie walked up to the dog, his small hands reaching out to pet him. "Diesel, you're brave," he said softly, his voice full of admiration. Diesel responded with a quiet nudge, his body relaxing under the touch of the child he had sworn to protect. The fear that had once been so overwhelming was still there, but now it had been tempered with love, trust, and a shared journey of healing. In that moment, Emily knew that Diesel had not only faced his past, he had overcome it. The storm within him wasn't gone, but it had lost its power to control him. He was no longer the broken dog they had rescued. He was their protector, their guardian, their family. And together, they would face whatever came next, not in fear, but in hope. The house was still, the quiet that had settled over it almost unnatural in its stillness. Emily stood at the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon, the faint light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something was about to change. It had been a while since the incident with the intruder, but the echoes of that day still haunted Emily. The intrusion had reminded her of the vulnerability they still faced, the world beyond their doorstep that could threaten everything they had worked so hard to build. Charlie, as usual, was in the living room, playing with Diesel. The two of them were inseparable, their bond stronger than ever. Diesel, despite his lingering fears, had become the heart of their family. His protective instincts, once driven by fear and trauma, had transformed into an unwavering commitment to keep Charlie safe. Emily had watched it unfold, had seen the dog grow from a creature shackled by his past to a loyal guardian who now moved with purpose and confidence. But even as she watched Charlie and Diesel playing together, Emily couldn't shake the nagging feeling that another trial was coming. A final test that would not only solidify the bond they shared, but also prove the extent of Diesel's healing. The fear and trauma that had been part of his life for so long still lingered beneath the surface. And Emily knew that true healing wasn't about avoiding fear. It was about facing it, confronting it, and coming out stronger on the other side. It was late afternoon when the warning signs came. The wind had started to pick up again, the trees outside swaying in the gusts. Diesel, who had been lying on his bed in the corner of the living room, immediately lifted his head, his ears twitching in alertness. His eyes darted toward the door, his body stiffening as the sound of a car engine roared in the distance. It was a sound that, for Diesel, meant only one thing: danger. His body tensed, his growl low and deep, as though he was instinctively preparing for whatever was to come. Emily's heart began to race. It had been months since they had heard that sound, the one that signaled the potential return of the man who had threatened their family. She couldn't believe it was happening again. It was too soon. She thought they were safe. "Diesel, what is it?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and disbelief. She watched the dog, whose body was now rigid with tension, his eyes fixed on the door, waiting for something, anything, to give him a sign of what was coming. Charlie, unaware of the fear in his mother's eyes, continued playing with his toys, oblivious to the storm that was brewing outside. Diesel, however, was fully aware, and he wasn't about to back down. The car engine grew louder, the sound of tires skidding across gravel growing nearer. Emily stood frozen in place, her mind racing. The door. The back door. The same one that had been opened that night. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed the police. But before she could press the final number, the sound of the car came to a halt. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She could feel it. The same sense of dread, the same feeling of being watched, of danger lurking at the edges of her reality. She turned to Diesel, who was still standing rigid, his growl now a low rumble in his chest. "Stay back, Charlie," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with a deep sense of urgency. "Go to your room. Lock the door." Charlie's eyes widened in confusion, but he did as he was told. Running toward his room, his small feet pattering down the hallway. Diesel remained by the door, his body a wall of solid muscle, ready for whatever was to come. And then, as the silence stretched on, it happened. A knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't have to look to know what was standing there. She already knew. The man. This time, she didn't hesitate. "Diesel, stay," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her chest. She took a step toward the door, her hand gripping the doorknob. But before she could open it, Diesel's body moved forward, positioning himself between her and the door, blocking her path. "Diesel," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have to stay. Stay inside." The dog didn't move. His body was tense, every muscle coiled, his eyes locked on the door as he growled, deep and low, his protective instincts at full force. Emily knew what Diesel was thinking. He wasn't just protecting her. He was protecting Charlie, the one person he loved above all else. And this time, the dog wasn't going to back down. Another knock came, this time more urgent, more forceful. Emily's heart raced as she stepped back, her hand trembling as she reached for her phone again. But the door suddenly burst open, the force of it sending a jolt through the house. The man stood in the doorway, his face a mask of anger and frustration. He looked at Emily, his eyes wild, and then his gaze shifted to Diesel. "Get out of my way!" the man shouted, his voice thick with rage. Diesel didn't budge. He stood firm, his body a living wall between the man and the family he had sworn to protect. The man took a step forward, but Diesel growled louder, his body tensing, ready to strike. Emily took a deep breath, stepping forward. She had to face him. This man who had come to take everything from her. This time, she wasn't going to back down. "You don't belong here?" Emily said, her voice firm and unyielding. "You're not welcome. Leave. Now." The man hesitated, his eyes flickering between Emily and Diesel, who was still growling, his teeth visible as he prepared to defend his family. And then, without warning, Diesel lunged, his body slamming into the man with a force that sent him crashing to the ground. The man yelped in surprise and fear, but Diesel didn't relent. The dog pinned him down, his massive body holding the man in place, his eyes filled with a protective fury that left no room for doubt. "Stay down," Emily said, her voice sharp as she stepped forward, her phone now in hand, ready to call the police. The man, terrified and realizing he was no match for the dog's power, struggled weakly beneath him. But Diesel didn't let go. Emily didn't wait for the man to make another move. She dialed the police, her voice calm but insistent as she reported the incident. "Please send help. There's an intruder in my home," she said, her voice steady, but her heart racing. "My dog is holding him down. He's protecting us." As the police arrived minutes later, the man was arrested, his attempts to fight back weak and futile. Diesel, though still on edge, slowly relaxed as he heard the approaching sirens, his body slowly loosening its tension. "Good boy," Emily whispered, kneeling beside him as the officers moved in to take the man away. Diesel, his protective instincts satisfied, lowered his head, his body finally beginning to relax. Charlie, who had been watching from the doorway, rushed toward Emily and Diesel, his face filled with awe and admiration. "Diesel saved us again," he said, his voice full of wonder. Emily nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of pride and relief. "Yes, he did," she said softly. "He'll always protect you." As the police took the man away and the danger finally passed, Emily stood with Charlie, Diesel by her side, watching as the night returned to silence. The storm had tested them. All of them. But they had come through it together, stronger than ever. Diesel had faced his fear, and in doing so, had proved that no matter the past, he would always stand by them, a silent guardian against the world.